the bottom of the pool were the big trout. Nick did not see them at first. Then he saw them at the bottom of the pool, big trout looking to hold themselves on the gravel bottom in a varying mist of gravel and sand, raised in spurts by the current. Nick looked down into the pool from the bridge. It was a hot day. A kingfisher flew up the stream.
Hey there, humans! My name is Magathea, and we have a special guest this weekish. This is my friend Nick Cialini. He is a Hemingway scholar, and so today we're going to talk about
In Our Time by Ernest Hemingway.
So take it away. Tell me about Hemingway.
Sure. Hemingway, one of the best-known writers out there. Partially rightfully, partially not so rightfully. Take your pick. I feel differently on different days. But one thing that he did do was define modernism and define what writing should look like since the early 1900s. Most people start learning writing by learning his iceberg theory, which is subtext, subtext, subtext. And when in doubt, subtext some more. The iceberg theory for Hemingway was that, much like an iceberg, the majority of what you're writing is underneath the surface of the writing. It's not in the text itself, it's beneath the text. All of what he's looking to do is cut, and cut some more. He learned this from Ezra Pound, who notoriously liked to write as few words as possible all the time. In Our Time is his first major publication. It started as the lowercase In Our Time, which was just the vignettes in 1923, and then a year later he published this slightly more extensive piece, where he...
Slightly more extensive.
Very slightly. Where he inserted stories in between the vignettes. Or vignettes between the stories. Depends on your point of view.
Okay, so In Our Time is a short story collection.
Yes.
Plus some little vignettes.
Right. Which is like micro stories.
Yeah.
So stories inside of stories, next to stories. All the stories... The majority of the stories center around Hemingway's to very autobiographical character, Nick Adams.
Do you feel a personal connection to Nick Adams because your name is also Nick?
Yes, I always have. And it's completely not sensical, but that's fine, but I take it. I also always find a connection to Hemingway in a weird way. Again, his autobiographical character is Nick, and I'm Nick. But in his old age, he became known as Papa Hemingway because he was apparently very much the teacher, which I don't really find as accurate.
Paternal Papa?
Paternal Papa, yeah.
Okay.
So I had a grandfather, I always called him Papa. He taught me how to fish. And he was always very, philosophical about fishing. So it's just, this added layer of, personal connection to Hemingway.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. What he does this whole time, so the reason the collection is called In Our Time, is he pulls from the Book of Common Prayer. The prayer goes something like this: Almighty and everlasting God, who orders all things both in heaven and on earth, mercifully hear the supplications of your people, and in our time grant us your peace. Through our Lord Jesus Christ, your Son, who lives and reigns with you in the unity of the Holy Spirit. So what he's setting up here is that Nick is searching for peace in his time.
Mm-hmm. Do you know when the Book of Common Prayer was written?
It was compiled over It was compiled over years in Catholic and Eastern Orthodox traditions, so...
That's fair.
I don't know.
I don't know either.
Yeah.
That's why I asked, but it's okay.
I'm only omniscient some of the time. I'm omniscient until I'm not.
You only know what I know.
Nick, in a story that Hemingway cut from this, Nick is revealed to be the author of the collection. Most of the stories are about him or people he interacted with. And if you take that reading of the whole collection, you can see shades of Hemingway's experiences through World War I and post-World War I, growing up in Michigan. All that sort of stitched, knitted, crocheted together makes this Nick both searching for peace in his actions of living life and in his writing process of processing life.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, I know you love Ernest Hemingway.
I do.
I know you love this book.
Yes.
What's messed up about it?
Enough.
What's the most messed up about it?
The most messed up about it is what I think is messed up with most of early high modernism. Most early high modernism that Ezra Pound has his mitts on. And that's, he's trying too hard to be a pile of messed up things. If you track The Wasteland, which is accordingly within our time, they're written similarly, they're both written under the guidance of Ezra Pound. They're both trying so hard to represent the fragmentation of life that they're feeling. It's, in a way, this is their emo punk stage, and they can't quite break out of the angst. So Nick breaks up with his girlfriend in the middle of this, hence the angst. And he kind of wants to, really wants to, but he also really doesn't want to because he's afraid of being alone. But his buddy Bill hates the fact that he's spending too much time with his girlfriend, so he kind of goads him into it. Then they get drunk together in the next story.
So, Bill is a douchebag.
Oh, Bill is a Class A douchebag.
Don't hang with Bills. Unless
Don't hang
they're
with
Bill Weasley.
I'll endorse Bill Weasley. But that's part of the core. I mean, Nick has, it's simultaneously a wonderful line and a terrible line, which is something Hemingway is great at. Even in the section that I read in the beginning, there were some wonderful, beautiful moments, and then it was a lot of Nick looked at the water. Nick liked to look at the water. It's when you distill too much, that's when you go past having a nice sipping whiskey and you get to moonshine. And that's when you've gone too far.
I feel like devices like that can be useful every once in a while. Like, in a 30-page story, do it once.
Yes. Yeah, I would totally agree. What Hemingway grapples with, I think, and struggles to get out of, what makes Hemingway bad. And to quote Saunders, another one I'm obsessed with right now, George Saunders, he says, the problem is that so many new writers find Hemingway Mountain and decide, I need to climb this, and I need to be Hemingway. And they're stuck for so long climbing Hemingway Mountain that they never realize that they have their own mountain to climb. And that's where I've found myself stuck in my own writing for quite a lot. But as great as all that was, I mean, it got me to the place where I started thinking of my writing as craft. Like, that's what interacting with Hemingway did for me, was that, one, not everything is relevant. Just because it happened that way doesn't mean it's part of the story.
Right.
And that writing is a craft, something to be intentionally attacked, to use a very Hemingway word, but to get away from that language, it's something to be honed and chipped away at, if we'll keep with the iceberg imagery. But the problem is that it's so easy to fall into, I'm just going to write the smallest little bit that I can, simple sentences. Stick to Nick looked at the river. He liked to look at the river. When you get caught in that, that eddy, keep with the water, stay with the water.
Well, like when I was writing The Tide, my original intention for that book was a series of vignettes. And they were like the tightest, most constrained pieces of fiction I'd ever written. When I took that into my MFA program, and I decided to start workshopping it a little bit there, the feedback I got back from every single mentor that I had who worked on it with me, and most of my peers in the writing workshops, was make it longer, get more in depth with these characters, get more in depth with these scenes. And
Which is almost the exact opposite advice that we received early on.
I know. I think, you need both sides, though. Like, The Tide wouldn't be right as just half-page long vignettes. The Tide has several half-page long vignettes that got smaller over time. But it also has some stories that are up to 6 pages long, which are still very short stories.
Well, it's like something we talked about earlier today. When we were going over something that you were writing now. Mm-hmm. This is a first shorter draft.
Right.
You have to look at things in different lights. So I always, when I teach Hemingway and when I teach literature, I always take a stop with Ezra Pound and interact with In the Station of the Metro. The entire poem is In the Station of the Metro. The apparitions of these faces on the crowd, the faces in the crowd, petals on a wet black bow. That's the entire poem. And
you wrote that on the ceiling of my bedroom from high school. The one,
did.
Yeah.
And I signed it, Per Emilio Fabro, Better Maker. Yeah, I forgot about that. Interesting.
Well, as you were reciting it, I could see it on the ceiling of my bedroom.
Well, I always teach that because the apocryphal backstory of it is that Pound was sitting in the metro in Paris and saw these faces strike him, and he wrote a 120-line poem, cut it down to 60 lines, cut it down to 30 lines, and eventually got to a 2-line poem, 3 arguably, but 2-line poem. And so I always teach that and say, okay, there's a lot we can draw from this, and in the Imagist sense, it's perfect. Mm-hmm. But, hi Luna.
Luna, come here, get in the camera. Hi Luna.
And so in the Imagist sense,
yeah,
it's the perfect poem.
Mm-hmm.
But in the grand sense, the question I always ask my students is this enough? Is this a poem that we can grab and have true, honest, emotional interaction with?
Right.
Which wasn't a priority for modernists, for Hemingway, for Eliot. They weren't looking necessarily for honest, emotional interaction, just interaction.
Right. It's almost like they were more concerned with creating an image representation than creating something that you could genuinely interact with.
Right. It's almost like they were crafting, I think this goes kind of across modernism's movements, from like high, precise, scientific modernism all the way to the Dadaists. Mm-hmm. I think you have this idea where they're creating an experience with their art, not necessarily a verisimilus, a true to real life experience, which I think is what we're more concerned with in contemporary art, is creating a verisimilar interaction with life.
Even in things that are like really far-flung, like epic fantasy and science fiction. Yeah,
absolutely. I remember I was reading a work of, actually my wife and I were listening to a particularly popular fantasy novel. We're listening to a particularly popular fantasy novel. And we kept getting to the part where there was one short character and one tall character, and it was
every tall character.
Yes, always. Every 5 or 6 sentences it was, and the short wanderer looked up to the tall character, and could barely see his face. Every few sentences, and they just didn't use names because they were keeping mystery. And it's like, you could tell me this was Fred McCurry, and I wouldn't know left from right in this world. It's the first chapter of this novel. I don't know that that name has power yet. You can give it to me. You can give me something other than one was tall, one was short.
It reminds me of Le Guin's essay on what's it called? How do you pronounce that town in New York?
Which one? Schenectady.
Schenectady.
Yeah.
Le Guin wrote an essay on fantasy language, and Schenectady. It's in her book, The Language of the Night, which I have in the other room in my suitcase. Because I found it, finally. It went missing in my house. But,
it doesn't. She just returned 2 books that went missing in her house to me 4 years ago.
Hi, Luna. Oh, you're such a good dog. But yeah, it reminds me of that. What she wrote in that essay. If I didn't have a dog paw on my lap, I would go get it. But too bad.
It's like Thor's hammer. You can't move it.
No, you can't. Any other closing thoughts on Hemingway?
Yeah, I think Hemingway is a wonderful tool in both senses of the word.
Hemingway's a wonderful tool.
I love his work because I do have entry point into it. His work was integral in my transformation as a writer.
Hi.
You're making it so hard to be serious, little girl. His writing was integral for me learning how to treat writing as a craft.
Yeah.
Learning how to be
I
intentional.
think for me too.
Yeah, well, Indian camp, right?
Yeah, we talked about that so much in
So
undergrad.
Because it's arguably a perfect story. And I say arguably because there's no such thing as a perfect story.
Right.
Because it could always be better. What is it? Paul McCartney always said if he could, he'd go back and re-record every single song the Beatles put together.
Mm-hmm.
Like, it could always be better.
Right.
But that's kind of Hemingway's shtick, is it can always be better. Break it down until it's as good as it's going to get.
Right.
And so his work taught me how to be intentional. But where the danger, where Hemingway kind of sucks, is the gravitas of his style, of his mythos, kind of pervades contemporary writing and contemporary manhood, but that's an entirely second conversation. The short version is what everybody thinks about Hemingway and manhood is mostly wrong. Not entirely, but mostly.
And yet he's still a douchebag tool?
And yet, he's still a tool.
We're just gonna give you lots of pets to end the video. We're gonna make this a bonus scene after I do the end credits. Look at you.